Imagine a quiet American town, the kind with white-painted porches, a diner that knows your breakfast order, and a church bell that rings on the hour even when nobody's listening. Now imagine that beneath those peaceful streets, the ground is breathing fire. Not a metaphor, real fire. Endless, invisible, alive. And the strangest part? The town is still there, smoldering gently, 60 years later. Welcome to Centralia, Pennsylvania, the place where the earth decided to turn up the thermostat and never turn it down again. You're listening to Sleepy Dreamer in America, where history burns slowly, and so do our eyelids. Long before the flames arrived, Centralia was just another coal town tucked in the green folds of eastern Pennsylvania. Founded in the mid-1800s, when coal was basically black gold, the town was small, proud, and permanently dusted with soot. It smelled faintly of iron and optimism. Coal dust stuck to every shirt collar, every prayer book, every ham sandwich, and every miner's lunch pail. But no one minded. Coal was the heartbeat of the nation, and this town was built right on top of it, literally and economically. Picture narrow brick homes, neat rows of gardens, kids chasing marbles down the hill, and in the distance, the slow clank of a mine elevator rising from the depths. It was noisy, smoky, and alive. Centralia's population hovered around 1,200 souls, one for each rumor, argument, or family feud that drifted through the streets. In a place this small, if you sneezed, your neighbor across the block would bless you before the echo stopped. By the turn of the century, coal money was good money. Men disappeared underground each morning like moles in uniforms, resurfacing at dusk with pay envelopes and coal-lined smiles. The taverns filled, the churches filled. Life was predictable and honest, and thick with community gossip. If Hallmark ever made a movie about industrial America, this could have been the set, minus the fact that the entire thing sat on an elaborate network of abandoned tunnels filled with leftover coal. A maze beneath a maze. Here's where irony lights its match. Coal, the town's reason for existing, is also its most flammable feature. Beneath Centralia ran miles of seams, thin veins of anthracite, hard and pure. Over a century of mining had hollowed the ground like a sponge. Locals knew the mine sometimes smoked or hissed. Sometimes the ground steamed on winter mornings. It wasn't ominous. It was just Pennsylvania being Pennsylvania. Still, by the 1950s, the coal industry was fading. Many miners had left for steel mills or new opportunities. Centralia shrank, but didn't vanish. It held on with small-town stubbornness, church picnics, baseball games, the occasional argument over whose dog was smarter. No one suspected that their peaceful valley was basically a gigantic matchbox waiting for one good spark. But sparks have a way of finding matches. Old miners used to say, the earth talks to you if you listen. Sometimes, before a collapse, the air hums or smells metallic. Centralia's earth had been whispering for years. Sighs of gas venting from forgotten shafts. Little puffs of warmth in strange places. People ignored it. Why wouldn't they? The human mind files away slow disasters as background noise. The ground felt solid enough under Sunday shoes, and besides, nobody had time to worry about invisible fires while the local baseball team was playing. Yet deep below, pockets of coal still waited, dry, brittle, and patient. The mines were mostly sealed but not hermetically sealed. There were shafts, cracks, tunnels, and vents connecting them like hidden hallways in a mansion no one remembered building. If the right flame ever wandered in, the whole structure would inhale. On the surface, life continued serenely into the early 1960s. Kids rode bikes past the cemetery, church bells chimed. The post office was the town's busiest gossip hub. The biggest local debate was over which diner served the better pie. It's funny in hindsight. People living right above a sleeping dragon and arguing about dessert. But that's how humanity survives, one slice of normalcy at a time. Coal mining. Towns had seen danger before. Cave-ins, explosions, gas leaks. But those belonged to the mines, not the streets. No one imagined a future where the danger would follow them home. And so Centralia carried on. blissfully unaware that a single careless fire would soon give it a place in American legend. Right, between Pompeii and that time someone microwaved metal. By 1962, the town council faced a mundane problem. The local dump had grown into a mountain of garbage. An eyesore, they said. A health hazard, they said. Nothing a little cleaning couldn't fix. And in Pennsylvania tradition, cleaning sometimes meant burning. Every Memorial Day, they'd light the dump to reduce waste. A simple small blaze watched by volunteer firefighters. They'd done it before. The ashes cooled, the town slept, everything fine. Except this time, the dump sat right above an abandoned mine shaft. And just beneath that shaft, a seam of anthracite coal that ran for miles in every direction. It was a setup worthy of Greek tragedy, or at least a cautionary tale in a safety handbook nobody bothered to read. The fire started innocently. Flames crackled, garbage burned, smoke drifted lazily into the blue. When the firemen doused it, everything seemed normal. But somewhere beneath, through a fissure no one noticed, embers slipped down into the dark, into the veins of coal, into forever. At first, there was nothing to see. A little warmth underfoot, perhaps, a faint whiff of something metallic on the breeze. A few weeks later, residents noticed wisps of smoke curling from cracks near the cemetery road. Probably just old mine gas, they said. It'll go out on its own. It didn't. By late summer, the smoke thickened, the ground grew warm. One man joked that at least they wouldn't need snow shovels come winter. Another said the devil must have bought property. The laughter was light, but the air had started to taste strange. Sour, chemical, uneasy. Beneath the jokes, a quiet question smoldered. What if it's not stopping? By autumn, the first small cracks appeared in the roads. Thin ribbons of steam escaped like the town itself was exhaling. Children poked at them with sticks. The postmaster reported headaches. Still, life went on. Church bells rang, coffee brewed, mail was delivered. Centralia didn't vanish overnight. It began to simmer. Coal fires, as scientists later explained, don't roar. They creep. They chew through the earth grain by grain, leaving behind hollow heat and toxic gas. They can burn, quietly for centuries, feeding on oxygen that seeps through the soil. But in 1962, nobody had that vocabulary yet. They just knew their basements were getting warmer. It's strange to think how peaceful disasters can be at the start. There's no alarm, no siren, no meteor from the sky, just a subtle change in the air. Centralia's first night of true danger probably looked beautiful. Glowing smoke under streetlights, a soft red haze rising over the hills. Someone might have even called it romantic. If you'd stood there, you'd smell burnt metal and damp stone. You'd feel the earth's faint pulse through your shoes. And you'd never guess that 60 years later, the same fire would still be burning under those hills, slowly erasing everything above. For now, the townspeople slept peacefully, warm. Perhaps a bit too warm, while the fire beneath them settled in for the long haul. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't dramatic. It was just the beginning of something that refused to end. The kind of story that keeps burning long after the credits roll. If you've ever watched smoke rise from a campfire, you know how hypnotic it is. It drifts, curls, and dances as if the air itself is dreaming. Now, imagine that. But the campfire is underground, miles wide, and refuses to go out no matter how much dirt you throw at it. That was Centralia in the summer of 1962, a campfire that the earth refused to extinguish. At first, the smoke was a curiosity. Kids would ride their bikes through it, pretending they were in a foggy mystery movie. It wasn't every day that your town developed its own microclimate. But soon, the novelty wore off. The air began to taste strange, metallic and acrid, like burnt pennies and forgotten machinery. It clung to your clothes and your hair, and no amount of opening the windows helped. Residents joked that the weather report should start including ash with a chance of sulfur. Still, no one panicked. This was the early 1960s. America was building highways, going to the moon, and convincing everyone that smoking was good for digestion. A little underground fire? Nothing small-town grit couldn't handle. So they did what small towns do best. They formed a committee. Centralia's borough council called in a few mining engineers. The experts poked around, measured gas levels, and nodded thoughtfully while scribbling on clipboards. Their verdict? Probably a small fire. Should be easy to put out. You could almost hear the universe snickering. They decided to dig trenches to cut off the fire's oxygen. They poured clay and sand into mine openings. They even tried to smother the flames with layers of rock and wet earth. On paper, it all sounded practical, like dealing with a stubborn barbecue pit. But underground, the fire didn't care. It was spreading through invisible tunnels, finding new seams of coal to feed on. Each attempt to seal it off just redirected the flames elsewhere, like squeezing one end of a balloon and watching the other side puff up. The miners used to say, "The coal knows where to go." And it did. As summer turned to autumn, strange, things began happening. The ground grew warm enough to melt the soles of work boots. Basements filled with a light haze. Thermometers plunged into soil near the dump read over 140 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, you could see a faint glow under the dirt, like embers in a fireplace no one remembered lighting. Dogs refused to walk certain streets. Birds flew low, then veered away suddenly, disoriented by the heat. The air felt different, denser, heavy with something that didn't belong there, and yet people stayed. Not because they were foolish, but because that's what people do. We stay until we absolutely can't. We make jokes about it. We hold barbecues next. Do it, we say things like, "It'll blow over," even when it's literally blowing up beneath us. By late 1963, the Pennsylvania Department of Mines got involved. They drilled boreholes to measure gas emissions and discovered carbon monoxide levels that would have made a canary pass out faster than a bad karaoke performance. But bureaucracy moves slowly, and the fire didn't. Reports were written, meetings held, plans proposed, all while the coal seam burned hotter and deeper. It was as if the town and the fire were playing chess, but only one side was aware there was a game. Still, the people clung to routine. Kids went to school. Sunday Mass was full. The town's baseball team still played in the park, even as smoke drifted lazily across the outfield. It was unsettling, sure, but not enough to break tradition. Centralia's heart kept beating, even as the earth beneath it began to crack. By 1966, the smoke had turned into something worse: breath. The ground itself seemed alive, exhaling in gusts of hot air from manholes, storm drains, and cracks in the pavement. One morning, the town's post office reported that letters stored in the basement had scorched at the edges. Another day, a woman noticed that the corner of her garden was steaming like a tea kettle. A miner named John Coddington reportedly joked, "Guess we're getting geothermal now." But the laughter was wearing thin. The fire had reached old mining tunnels that ran directly under the town center. Temperatures underground had climbed past 700 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite new seams. Scientists tried everything: drilling, sealing, flooding. But the problem was simple and devastating. No one knew exactly where the fire was anymore. It had spread like an underground spiderweb, unpredictable and unreachable. By the early 1970s, the government began quietly relocating a few homes near the hottest zones. The first residents to leave did so reluctantly, with a strange mix of embarrassment and relief. "I never thought the ground would evict me," one woman told a reporter. But for most Centralians, leaving wasn't an option. Their mortgages, memories, and entire lives were tied to this patch of smoky ground. So they stayed. They shoveled snow, baked pies, mowed lawns, and ignored the occasional column of smoke curling out of their driveways. There's a certain absurd bravery in that, pretending everything is fine while your town literally smolders. But it's also heartbreakingly human. Change is harder to face than fire. In 1972, a group of engineers presented yet another proposal to finally extinguish the Centralia fire. It would involve digging an enormous trench, injecting inert gases, and sealing the entire area. The price tag: about $40 million. The local government said they couldn't afford it. The state hesitated. The federal government blinked. Meanwhile, the fire kept eating, quietly, patiently. Had they acted decisively back then, maybe Centralia could have been saved. But history rarely gives refunds. The proposal was shelved, and the town went back to waiting. By the late 1970s, Centralia had become something between a ghost story and a science experiment. Smoke drifted year-round. Grass refused to grow in certain spots. Asphalt buckled. Children would place sticks into cracks and watch them catch fire. At night, the glow from underground gave some streets a soft red hue. It was beautiful in a haunting way, like the town had its own northern lights, except made of carbon monoxide. One visitor described it as a place caught between life and death. Centralia wasn't gone yet, but it was fading, quietly, like the end of a song that refuses to finish. It's strange how adaptable people can be. After a while, even smoke becomes background noise. Residents learned which cracks to avoid, which basements to ventilate, which houses to skip on the trick-or-treat route. The high school's football team joked about being on fire this season. But underneath the humor was fatigue. The fire was everywhere and nowhere. Every solution failed. Every promise dissolved. Still, on Sunday mornings, the church bell rang. On Friday nights, the local bar was full, and beneath it all, the ground kept breathing. By the end of the 1970s, the town's fate was quietly sealed, even if no one said it aloud. The fire had burned for nearly 20 years. The air was toxic in places. Carbon monoxide monitors had become as common as coffee mugs. The government warned that the fire could burn for another 100 years. Centralia laughed nervously. And then, in 1981, the Earth decided to make its point. By 1981, Centralia had grown used to the strange new rhythm of life. The smoke, the smell, the occasional street cracking open. It had all become normal in the same way that living next to a train line becomes background noise after a while. You stop hearing it, even though it's always there. But the ground was getting restless. The quiet breathing of the earth was beginning to sound more like a warning. It happened on a February afternoon. Cold, gray, the kind of Pennsylvania day where even the sun looks tired. 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was playing in his grandmother's backyard when the ground suddenly opened up beneath him. 1 second he was running, the next, gone. The hole swallowed him like the earth had simply decided to erase a sentence mid-story. It was roughly 4 feet wide, and when rescuers arrived, they discovered it plunged nearly 150 feet down into a pit of hot, smoking air that smelled of sulfur and decay. The temperature inside was measured at over 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Todd survived because his cousin managed to grab his arm just in time, pulling him out of the steaming void before the edges collapsed completely. For Centralia, this wasn't just a near tragedy. It was the Earth's loudest announcement yet. The fire was still there, and it wasn't going anywhere. News crews swarmed the town. Helicopters circled. Reporters used words like apocalyptic, hellish, and uninhabitable. The story of the boy and the burning ground spread across the country. For the first time, the rest of America saw what Centralia had been quietly living with for 2 decades. And everyone suddenly had an opinion. To outsiders, it looked like a ghost town in slow motion. Streets cracked open, homes half abandoned, smoke drifting out of manholes. A few houses still had curtains in the windows, like they were pretending nothing was wrong. But to those who lived there, Centralia wasn't dead yet. It was sick, maybe. Tired, definitely, but not dead. People still gathered for coffee, the church still held services. The mail still came, though the post office basement was too hot to use. You could drive down the main street and see kids playing in yards that steamed faintly at the edges, like morning dew on fire. Scientists returned, drilling new boreholes, running tests, shaking their heads. The fire, they said, had now expanded beneath 300 acres. Temperatures underground were higher than they'd ever been. The mine voids, those endless tunnels from a century of digging, acted like highways for the flames, carrying heat and gas beneath homes miles apart. No one could even map the fire's full reach anymore. It was like trying to chart a ghost. The government stepped in, this time with serious intent. There were meetings, congressional hearings, disaster declarations. Money was promised. Millions of dollars for relocation and containment. For the first time, officials admitted publicly that the fire was unstoppable. The town was doomed, though the word itself was rarely used. They said unsafe. They said uninhabitable. They said resettlement. But the truth was simple. Centralia had lost its war with the earth. Still, not everyone wanted to leave. This was home, after all. The kind of place where people had built their lives, buried their parents, planted their gardens. You can't evacuate memories. One man told a reporter, "The ground's been hot for 20 years. If it wanted to eat me, it would have done it by now." That stubbornness, equal parts courage and denial, became Centralia's defining trait. While the government began buying out properties, some residents refused to sell. They patched their roofs, shoveled their driveways, waved to the few cars that still passed through town. It was eerie in its normalcy. The fire raged below, invisible and constant, while above, laundry flapped gently in the breeze. The government offered relocation money, and many families took it. Their houses bulldozed soon after to prevent squatters. Empty lots multiplied. What was once a compact town began to look like a missing puzzle. Open spaces where homes had stood for generations. Yet a handful of people dug in their heels. They called themselves the stay-behinds. They said the danger was exaggerated, that the fire wasn't near their part of town, that the media had turned their lives into a circus, and in a way, they were right. The fire's spread was uneven. Some patches of ground were stable and cool, while just down the street, the soil could melt rubber soles. You could stand on one side of a fence and be fine, while the other side could kill you in minutes. It made Centralia unpredictable, a checkerboard of safe and unsafe, real and surreal. Over the next few years, the government turned up the pressure. Evacuation became mandatory in certain zones. Utility lines were cut, houses condemned. Bulldozers rolled through streets that had once echoed with children's laughter. By the late 1980s, what had been a thriving community was reduced to a handful of stubborn homes surrounded by fields of smoking earth. Nature began to take over in strange ways. Grass grew tall through cracked sidewalks. Deer wandered through what used to be Main Street. Wildflowers sprouted where mailboxes once stood. Centralia, once powered by coal, was now being slowly reclaimed by roots and silence. But even as the last businesses closed, a few houses still showed signs of life. Curtains in the windows, smoke from a chimney, a flag fluttering on a porch. It was as if the residents were holding a quiet vigil for a town the world had already buried. In 1992, the state officially invoked eminent domain. Every remaining property was claimed by the government, and residents were ordered to vacate. But paperwork doesn't always translate to obedience. Some refused still. They took their fight to court, arguing that the danger was overstated, that the fire had stabilized. They weren't just resisting eviction, they were resisting erasure. Centralia was no longer a town in the traditional sense. It was an idea, a memory with a zip code, and beneath it all the fire kept burning, moving through seams of coal laid down 300 million years ago, back when the earth was a swamp and dinosaurs hadn't even filled out their timesheets yet. It's strange to think that a careless spark, a single match in a garbage pit, had outlasted an entire community, an entire generation, even the buildings themselves. By the mid-1990s, the town's population had dropped from 2,200 to under 50. The zip code was officially retired. The post office, once the town's gossip center, was torn down. The church remained perched on a hill, its white steeple watching over what was now a landscape of steam and silence. On Sundays, the priest still gave mass to a congregation that could fit into a single pew. The fire below had become legend, something no longer feared but accepted. like an unwanted relative who'd moved into the basement and refused to leave. The people of Centralia had learned to live with an enemy they couldn't see. The rest of America, meanwhile, had learned something else, that a town could vanish without a single explosion, without a war, without even a goodbye. It could simply fade, quietly, steadily, until the only thing left was the story. And Centralia's story wasn't finished yet. The flames were still eating, still breathing, still humming beneath the hills even as the town above was reduced to empty roads and whispers. The fire had won the first battle, but what came next was something even stranger. A slow motion, ghosting of an entire place, where life and ruin coexisted, and where the line between myth and reality blurred like smoke in a cold morning sky. By the time the 1990s rolled around, Centralia had entered its quiet twilight, a town half alive, half legend. The streets still had names, but most no longer led anywhere. Maps showed a place that existed more in memory than in geography. And beneath it all, the fire hummed on, the same way an old refrigerator keeps running long after you've stopped noticing the sound. The government had made its decision. Centralia, Pennsylvania, was no longer safe to live in. Houses that once held families, laughter, and backyard barbecues were now marked with red spray paint. Condemned, scheduled for demolition. There wasn't a dramatic evacuation. No loudspeakers or convoys. Just quiet goodbyes. One by one. Families. Packed boxes, loaded trucks, and drove away. You could almost hear the sighs of the town itself as people locked their doors for the last time. The state offered compensation, enough to buy a new home somewhere less flammable. But you can't buy what makes a place home. You can't replace the church you were married in, or the tree you carved your initials into, or the front porch that creaks the same way your grandfathers did. For many, leaving was like losing a person. You didn't just move, you mourned. Yet, a few people refused to mourn. They stayed. They were the stubborn hearts of Centralia, the ones who said, "The fire hasn't reached my porch, so it's not my problem." Some called them brave, others called them foolish. But they didn't care what anyone called them. They were home. They kept mowing their lawns, even if the grass grew through cracked asphalt. They kept hanging Christmas lights, even if there were no neighbors left to see them. One man even repainted his front door every spring, as though the right color might somehow keep the world from forgetting his house existed. The town council had long since dissolved. The schools were closed, the stores shuttered, the playgrounds overgrown. But at night, a few windows still glowed with lamplight, little constellations of defiance scattered across a landscape of steam and silence. Some of those who stayed began to feel a strange pride. They weren't just residents anymore. They were guardians of a story. When journalists came, the Centralians would invite them in for coffee, tell them about life above the fire, and insist it wasn't as bad as people said. They'd smile and say, "You get used to the smoke after a while." But the smoke had a mind of its own. It seeped into houses, coated the walls, and left a metallic tang in the air. Some days you'd wake up to find the fog so thick outside your window that it looked like the world had vanished. For those who left, Centralia became a ghost they carried with them. They told their kids about the town that burned beneath its own feet. They'd show old photos, 4th of July parades, baseball games, snowy Christmas mornings, and then quietly add, "That place doesn't exist anymore." The loss was slow and uneven. Some homes stood for years, surrounded by fields where entire neighborhoods used to be. Others were bulldozed so quickly that one day you'd wave to a neighbor, and the next day their house was gone. Nothing left but a rectangle of dirt and maybe an old mailbox. The post office itself became one of the last symbols to fall. When it closed, the town's zip code, 17927, was retired, as if the government was erasing Centralia from the official record of reality. Even letters couldn't find their way back anymore. And yet, for the few who stayed, that was fine. They didn't want sympathy or spectacle. They wanted quiet. They wanted normal. And in a strange way, they got it. Centralia became peaceful again. Not because the fire stopped, but because the noise around it did. No more news crews, no more inspectors, no more promises of saving what was already gone. Just a handful of people, a handful of houses, and an underground fire humming its endless tune. If you drove through town around this time, you might not even realize what you were seeing. A stretch of road, a few scattered homes, telephone poles, leaning slightly like tired old men. You might notice the smell, that faint chemical sweetness in the air, or a patch of fog rising from nowhere. But otherwise, it looked like any other quiet rural road, except for the heat under your feet. Locals joked that in winter, Centralia was the warmest town in Pennsylvania. Snow melted in perfect circles where the ground still burned. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A town famous for coal fires now enjoyed free central heating. But beneath the humor was something heavier, the unspoken truth that the fire had won. The town hadn't exploded like the headlines once said. It had simply evaporated. By the late 1990s, only a dozen residents remained. They knew each other by name, by car, by the sound of each other's doors. It was like living in an echo chamber of the past. You'd walk down the street and hear the wind move through empty lots where children once played, and for a moment, it would sound like laughter. The government offered buyouts again in the 2000s. A few more people accepted. A few more houses vanished. The remaining residents filed lawsuits, and after years of legal battles, they won the right to live out their lives there. But once they passed away, their homes would finally revert to the state. The compromise was simple and sad. Centralia could exist only as long as its last citizens did. After that, it would officially end. Above ground, time slowed to a crawl. Below, it didn't. The fire burned through new seams, reaching deeper, spreading wider. Scientists estimated it could continue for another 200 years, maybe more. The Mao town was no longer a disaster site. It was a monument to stubbornness, to loss, to the strange persistence of both fire and memory. And as nature crept back, Centralia started to look almost beautiful again. Trees reclaimed sidewalks. Wildflowers painted the ruins. The smoke vents, those eerie scars in the ground, became part of the landscape. Little reminders that the world isn't as solid as it looks. Sometimes beauty and ruin share the same breath. For those who drove through, Centralia felt like a dream half remembered, too real to be imaginary, too empty to be alive. The air shimmered with heat, the roads split like open books, and here and there, signs of human life still lingered. A swing set rusting in the wind, a mailbox standing proudly in front of nothing. The fire below no longer roared, it pulsed, a slow heartbeat beneath a town that had forgotten how to wake up. And for the handful of people who still called it home, that was enough. They lived quietly, cooked breakfast, tended gardens, and went to bed each night above an invisible inferno. They had stopped trying to fight the fire. They had learned to live with it, because sometimes that's all you can do. Not extinguish the heat of the past, but learn how to breathe through its smoke. By the early 2000s, Centralia had stopped being a place people lived in and started being a place people visited. Not for family reunions or Sunday dinners, those were long gone, but for curiosity, for the eerie novelty of standing on a road that still smoked. It had become something strange, a ghost town that refused to disappear completely, a real-life monument to a slow-motion apocalypse. Teenagers from nearby towns started sneaking in late at night, drawn by the rumors. Glowing ground, burning holes, ghostly figures in the mist. It was the kind of legend that lived best under the light of a flashlight and the sound of crunching gravel. But what they found wasn't fire and brimstone. It was quiet. Vast, unnervingly quiet. You could hear the sound of wind moving through, empty trees, the occasional hiss from a vent in the ground, and your own breath echoing in the cold. The air smelled faintly metallic, tinged with something that sat somewhere between burnt rubber and memory. By daylight, Centralia looked more like a postscript than a town. The outlines of roads still existed, some with fading yellow lines leading nowhere. Patches of asphalt had caved in or buckled, like the ground itself had exhaled and forgotten to inhale again. One of those roads, a stretch of old Route 61, became the heart of Centralia's strange second life. It was cracked, broken, and still warm in places, venting thin streams of steam. And over time, people began to leave their mark on it. At first, just a few spray-painted words. A name, a date, a message like, "We're still here." Then more. Then more. Soon the entire highway was covered, layer after layer of color, phrases, drawings, hearts, peace signs, and jokes. It was as if the whole world had shown up to leave graffiti on the town's tombstone. They called it the graffiti highway. It became a paradox, a place of ruin that somehow felt alive. Tourists came from all over to walk the smoking asphalt. You'd see families posing for photos, couples writing their initials inside hearts, friends painting bright wings across the cracked pavement so someone could stand between them and look like they were flying. For a town destroyed by fire, Centralia had become unexpectedly vibrant. It wasn't what anyone would have predicted. The government had fenced off most of the area by then, posting warning signs about dangerous gases and unstable ground. But fences don't stop curiosity. People climbed over anyway, armed, with cameras and a fascination for the surreal. Centralia had turned into something between an art project and an urban myth, a place where nature, destruction, and human creativity collided in spray-painted poetry. And the irony was hard to miss. The road that once led into the heart of a town now led straight into silence. The fire still burned beneath, of course. It hadn't stopped, not for a day. The heat pulsed quietly under the graffiti-covered road, as if the flames themselves were reading the messages left above. Some of the writing was darkly funny. Caution, hot property. Others were oddly hopeful. You can't kill what still glows. It was human nature distilled. When faced with ruin, we make art. The remaining residents didn't love the attention. To them, Centralia wasn't a theme park. It was home, or had been. They didn't like strangers wandering near what was left of their porches or treating their tragedy like a photo op. But time has a way of shifting perspective. For those who stayed, Centralia's fame was bittersweet. Irritating at times, yet strangely comforting. It meant the world hadn't forgotten. By the 2010s, the town was world famous, in that internet way where people read about it at 2 a.m. and then watched drone footage of cracked roads and fog rising through trees. Urban explorers came by the dozens, walking through the remnants like archaeologists from the future. Some came to feel the heat. Others came just to say they'd been there, to touch a ghost that was still warm. The graffiti highway became a symbol of resistance, color, and memory. It was beautiful, in a chaotic human kind of way, proof that even destruction can't stop people from trying to leave something behind. But beauty, like fire, attracts attention. Too much of it. As the years went on, more tourists meant more problems. Vandalism, litter, trespassing, and the occasional brush with danger when someone got too close to a steaming vent. Eventually, in 2020, the owners of the land, tired of the mess, the noise, and the risk, made a decision. They brought in dump trucks filled with dirt and gravel, and they buried the graffiti highway. Just like that, one of the last visible pieces of Centralia's strange second life vanished. Beneath the soil, it was almost poetic. The fire had started with someone trying to bury garbage, and decades later, the town's most famous road ended up buried too. But even with the road gone, Centralia never really faded from imagination. Writers, photographers, and filmmakers kept returning to it and drawn by its silence, its stubbornness, its beauty and decay. There was something magnetic about the place, something that felt like it existed outside of time. The few remaining houses still stood quietly among fields of grass. Deer wandered through the ruins. Wildflowers bloomed where storefronts used to be. If you didn't know what had happened there, you might just think it was a strangely empty countryside. Peaceful, even serene. But if you listened closely, you could still hear it. A faint hiss beneath your shoes. The sound of the earth still exhaling. Scientists still visit from time to time. The readings haven't changed much. Temperatures deep underground remain. Hot enough to bake stone. The gases still rise in unpredictable places. The fire still moves. Slowly, steadily, with the patience of geology itself. They say it could burn for another 200 years, maybe more. That means the fire of Centralia could outlast our grandchildren's grandchildren. The same heat that started with a careless spark could still be glowing in the year 2200. The thought is strangely comforting, in a melancholy way. The town might be gone, but its heartbeat continues underground. Centralia has become more than a tragedy. It's a reminder that progress, no matter how advanced, still humbles itself before nature. That every bright idea, like burning a dump above a coal seam, can have consequences far greater than anyone imagines. And yet, it's also a story about endurance, about people who refuse to leave, about a fire that refused to die. Most towns vanish because they're forgotten. Centralia vanished because it refused to be ignored. Even now, people still come, not for the graffiti or the headlines, but for something quieter. To stand in a place where you can literally feel history under your feet. To breathe the strange, heavy air and think about everything that once was and everything that still is. It's impossible not to feel something there. Awe, sadness, curiosity, maybe even peace. Because in a world that moves too fast, Centralia stands perfectly still. A town that burned, but never truly went out. If you were to stand above Centralia today, you might not see much. A few roads that don't connect, a scattering of foundations swallowed by weeds, and a silence that feels thicker than air. But deep below, the earth is still glowing. Not in flames you can see, but in heat you can feel if you stand long enough. That's the thing about coal fires. They don't roar. They whisper. They don't consume everything in a flash. They consume it grain by grain, atom by atom, until what's left is hollow and warm and endless. Centralia isn't the only place like this, not even close. It's just the most famous one in America. The one that got the headlines, the documentaries, and the eerie drone footage. But across the world, there are dozens of Centralias still burning right now. In India's Jharia coalfields, fires have been raging since the early 1900s, swallowing whole neighborhoods and creating a landscape of burning pits that glow red through the night. In China, massive underground fires stretch across entire mountain ranges, hidden beneath villages where the ground can reach boiling temperatures. Australia has one too, the Mount Wingan fire, known poetically as the Burning Mountain. It's been smoldering for roughly 6,000 years. 6,000 years. It started back when humans were still figuring out agriculture, and it's still quietly cooking its way through the rock today. So in a strange way, Centralia isn't even exceptional, it's just newer. What makes it different is that it happened here, in the middle of a modern American town, surrounded by roads, schools, and lunch pails. It wasn't a distant mining site or an ancient ridge. It was somebody's backyard, somebody's street. And maybe that's why it feels so haunting. Because Centralia is a reminder that the ground beneath us is not as stable as we like to pretend. Coal seam fires are an old enemy, but a patient one. Once ignited, they can last centuries. They move unpredictably through cracks and fissures, feeding on oxygen that seeps through soil. Rain doesn't stop them. Snow doesn't cool them. And water, well, pour enough of it down and you might just make steam explosions instead. They burn invisibly. You can't see the flame, but you can feel the heat. And that's almost worse, because you start to wonder where it is, how close, how far, how deep. Scientists who study Centralia call it a natural laboratory, which is the polite academic way of saying we can't fix it. So let's learn from it. They've spent decades drilling holes, measuring gas composition, and mapping the underground voids like a subterranean weather forecast. Some of those readings are unsettling. temperatures deep below the surface still hover near 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The fire has moved far beyond the original ignition point, and it continues to find new seams of coal to feed on, inching forward each year like a slow heartbeat. If you were to walk across Centralia at night with a thermal camera, you'd see rivers of heat beneath your feet, winding veins of orange and red that pulse like magma. It's eerie, but beautiful too. There's something almost poetic about it, the idea that the Earth can carry a wound for centuries and still breathe through it. Centralia has become a case study for environmental scientists, urban planners, and anyone interested in how humans respond to slow disasters. Because this one wasn't a hurricane or an earthquake or anything dramatic. It was a problem that crept quietly beneath the surface, the kind that never made the evening news until a child almost disappeared into it. And that's maybe the scariest kind of disaster. The slow kind, the one you live with every day, until it's simply part of your life. For those who study it, Centralia is both a tragedy and a teacher. It shows how deeply our modern lives depend on the invisible infrastructure below us, and how fragile that really is. We walk on pavement, never thinking about the layers beneath. Soil, rock, fossilized carbon from ancient forests. All it takes is one spark to turn that ancient memory into something alive again. In that sense, Centralia is like a clock that won't stop ticking, a reminder that human time and geological time move at very different speeds. We measure progress in decades. The Earth measures change in centuries. Some researchers have proposed letting the Centralia fire burn itself out naturally. It could take 250 years, maybe more. Others suggest monitoring it indefinitely. A slow-motion experiment in heat, chemistry, and patience. Either way, the outcome is the same. The fire stays. Every so often, someone brings up the idea of reclaiming Centralia, turning it into a museum or a park or an educational site. But the fire makes that difficult. Even if the surface looks calm, the ground below can collapse without warning. Still, that hasn't stopped people from imagining. Museum above a fire, a monument to persistence, a warning disguised as art. Something about the story of Centralia calls to dreamers. Maybe because it's not just about coal and heat, it's about human stubbornness too. The same stubbornness that built the town, that refused to leave it, and that keeps visiting it long after it's gone. There's something strangely comforting about the thought that a fire could last longer than an empire, that the ground itself holds memories longer than we do. Centralia's fire is not angry, it's not vengeful, it's just doing what nature does, consuming, transforming, breathing, waiting. And if you think about it too long, it starts to sound a little like us. We too burn through our fuel. We too leave smoke behind. We too try to cover our mistakes with dirt and hope they never surface again. Maybe that's why people keep coming here. Not to see what was lost, but to feel what still remains. A quiet reminder that nothing really disappears. It just changes form. Some nights when the wind blows through the hollowed valleys, it sounds like a sigh, a long, slow exhale from the heart of the earth itself. And if you listen long enough, you might hear something else in that sound, a kind of peace. Because there's a strange serenity in the knowledge that the world keeps going, even when the towns don't, that the fires, both literal and metaphorical, continue to burn long after we've gone to sleep, and that somewhere beneath us, the earth still remembers. There's something about a fire that never dies that feels personal. Maybe that's why people can't stop talking about Centralia, because deep down we all have our own version of it, something that keeps burning quietly under the surface. Long after we've told ourselves it's over, Centralia became more than a story about coal. It became a story about memory, stubbornness, and the way places, like people, refuse to disappear completely. Even now, people speak about it like a ghost that won't leave the room. They say the ground hums if you stand still, that you can feel the heartbeat of the fire under your feet, that sometimes when the fog rolls in just right, You can almost see the outlines of houses that aren't there anymore. Of course, the scientists will tell you it's just heat distortion, light bending through warm air, nothing supernatural. But then again, isn't memory just another kind of light bending? Centralia has become a legend, the town that burns forever. A modern myth told in classrooms, documentaries, and campfires, often with the same tone you'd use to describe Atlantis or Pompeii, or some cursed village swallowed by the sea. Except this story is real, and it's still happening. For many, Centralia represents the fragility of human ambition. We built a town on top of fire and expected it to behave. We dug into the earth for what we wanted, and forgot that the earth might dig back someday, but others see it differently. To them, Centralia isn't just a cautionary tale. It's a reflection of us at our most human, inventive, reckless, hopeful, and deeply unwilling to admit when something's truly gone. There's a peculiar beauty in that. The same beauty that makes us build castles on cliffs or cities on rivers that flood every spring. We know the risk, but we do it anyway. Because living without risk would mean never building anything at all. The people who stayed behind in Centralia, those few who refused to leave, understood that better than anyone. They weren't defying nature. They were acknowledging it. Accepting the fire as part of the deal, they lived above it, not despite it. There's a strange poetry in their resilience. When everything around them vanished, the stores, the neighbors, the laughter, they stayed. Not because they thought the fire would stop, but because they believed home was worth outlasting. Even now, the handful of residents left live quietly among ruins and wildflowers. They still decorate for Christmas. They still wave to the occasional tourist who gets lost. Their houses stand like punctuation marks at the end of a long sentence the world already stopped reading. And yet, the story isn't finished. Every so often, a filmmaker shows up with a drone. A photographer comes looking for the perfect shot of the steaming hills. A YouTuber drives through and whispers into the camera like they've stumbled onto the gates of the underworld. It's easy to romanticize a burning town. The colors, the silence, the sense that you're standing on top of something bigger than yourself. But Centralia isn't hell. It's just a mistake that's been burning long enough to look like myth. It's not angry. It's just persistent. There's a legend that floats around, that you can still hear church bells from under the ground on quiet nights. It's not true, of course. There's nothing left down there that could ring. But stories like that stick because they feel right. They sound like the kind of thing a place like Centralia should have. A town swallowed by fire deserves to echo. Maybe that's why people keep telling its story, to give it a voice that can still be heard above the hiss of smoke and time. And it's not the only town like that. All across America, there are places that vanished quietly. Towns drowned under reservoirs, villages erased by highways, mining camps forgotten in the dust. We like to think of history as progress, a neat line moving forward. But it's really more like a patchwork of glowing embers, some still warm, some long cold, all connected beneath the surface. Centralia just happens to glow a little brighter. Some people say the fire is punishment, nature reclaiming what was taken. Others say it's a metaphor for industry, greed, or the hubris of man. But maybe it's none of that. Maybe it's just the natural world doing what it does best, reminding us that we are small and temporary, and occasionally flammable. And maybe that's not such a bad reminder, because even in destruction there's continuity. The same coal that powered cities, trains, and factories still powers something now. Not machines, but stories. Centralia continues to heat the imagination, to warm the curiosity of anyone who hears its name. It has become, in its own strange way, eternal. You could call it haunting, but I think it's more like persistence. The kind of persistence that keeps flowers pushing through cracked sidewalks or laughter echoing in an empty house long after the people have gone. And that's what Centralia is now, a place that shouldn't exist, but somehow does. A place both gone and not gone. A flickering reminder that even when everything burns down, something always remains. Maybe it's memory, maybe it's smoke, Maybe it's just the faint hum of the earth continuing to do what it's always done. Turn heat into time and time into story. So the next time you hear about a town that vanished, or a fire that never dies, remember Centralia, the place where the ground still glows, the mail no longer comes, and the silence feels strangely alive. It's not a tragedy. Not anymore. It's just unfinished. And maybe that's why it endures, because every story that never ends is one we never stop telling. If you drive through Pennsylvania and don't know what you're looking for, you might miss it. A curve in the road, a patch of trees, a place where the air smells faintly of ash and rain. That's Centralia. It doesn't announce itself. There's no grand sign that says, "Welcome to the town that vanished." No museum, no souvenir shop, no gift stand selling "I survived Centralia" t-shirts. Just a few old roads and the quiet hum of wind where houses used to stand. Most of the land is empty now, a kind of silence that feels heavy, like the earth is still holding its breath. But if you stop, roll down your window and just listen, you might hear the faint hiss of steam rising through the grass. The steady exhale of a fire that refuses to die. Somewhere down there, maybe 1,000 feet below where you stand, the heat still moves through the rock. Slowly, patiently. Every so often, a new pocket of gas escapes and makes the ground sigh. A reminder that the story isn't over yet, and maybe it never will be. Centralia is still burning, not wildly, not visibly, not in flames that reach the sky, but in a slow, quiet burn that will likely last longer than any of us. It's strange to think that somewhere beneath the hills of Pennsylvania, there's a fire older than most of the people alive today. A fire that started because someone wanted to clean up a dump. There's a lesson in that, though it doesn't. Shout it. The earth doesn't forget easily. We like to think we control it, that with enough technology and enough meetings and enough optimism we can fix anything. But Centralia reminds us that sometimes the simplest mistakes echo the longest. And yet it's not just a story about failure, it's also about endurance. About the quiet dignity of a place that refused to vanish entirely, even when logic said it should have. Because even now, more than 60 years later, Centralia is still here. Not on most maps, not in the census, but in the imagination. It lives, in photographs, in whispers, in the endless curiosity of people who can't resist driving just a little out of their way to see what remains. And what they find isn't destruction, it's peace. There's no sound except the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves through hollow chimneys. The grass waves gently in the heat that seeps from the ground. The horizon glows faintly in the evening sun, and for a moment, you could almost believe the town is still breathing. Maybe it is. Some fires burn to destroy. Others burn simply to exist, to keep the world a little warmer, even as it changes everything around them. Centralia's fire is both. It took a town, but it left behind a story that refuses to go out. And there's something strangely comforting about that. To know that long after the last light in the last house faded, something kept glowing in the dark. That's the thing about history. It doesn't always end with a bang. Sometimes it just keeps burning, quietly, beneath our feet. If you stand there long enough, the smoke will curl around your shoes and you'll smell the faint trace of metal and dust. You'll feel the warmth rising through the soles of your shoes, ancient and steady. And you'll understand, in that wordless way that the earth teaches, that nothing ever really disappears. It just changes form. The people who left Centralia carried it with them, in stories, in photographs, in the way their eyes softened when they said the name. The people who stayed became part of its myth, caretakers of a flame they never asked for but refused to abandon. The fire kept their names. The land remembers them. And maybe that's enough, because in the end, what's a town but the memory of people who lived there? The laughter, the noise, the everyday lives that once filled the space. Those things don't vanish. They just drift, like smoke in the wind, moving from one century to the next. When night falls over Centralia, there are no lights in the windows anymore, no voices echoing from porches. But the stars are bright, brighter than they've been in decades. The air hums softly with warmth from below. And somewhere in that gentle balance of earth and sky, you can almost hear it. The town still breathing. Not in pain, not in protest. Just breathing, as if it's dreaming. And that's where we leave it tonight. A town that sleeps beneath its own flame. A story that never quite ends. A quiet reminder that the world burns and rebuilds and remembers over and over again. If you ever drive through Pennsylvania and see mist rising from the ground, don't be afraid. It's not a ghost. It's not the devil's work. It's just history, still exhaling after all this time. And maybe somewhere deep down, Centralia is still dreaming too.